What Do You See in 2023? And I think, and his latest book is sold out. And the reason that's important because the first part of this program was on China, and China is supply chain. So our supply chain is now disrupted big time. And as Jim says, supply chain is the economy. In other words, if you can't get aspirin, you can't get this, you can't get toilet paper, you're in serious trouble. It is the economy. So with that, welcome back, Jim, for this is the first part of 4, What Do You See in 2023? And we're discussing China. And I'll give you, please talk about sold out really quickly, because this is the other day I was thinking about you. I was eating blueberries. Now, generally blueberries, I believe, come from Vermont, but here it is hardcore winter. And I think my blueberries were coming from Ecuador. That's supply chain, right?
Absolutely, that's a long supply chain. I don't know the exact distance, but probably a good, 4,000 or 5,000 miles. One of them could be semiconductors or oil or blueberries, but stuff moves all over the world. That's exactly right. It's being very disrupted right now. Well, we spoke about China and covered that pretty in depth. So just to turn to the next thing I see in 2023 having a major impact on markets, I would say the situation in Ukraine. And there's a lot more there than just, there's obviously a war going on, clear, and Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the background of that. I have some pretty strong views. I think they're pretty well documented. Everyone's like, Russia's the bad guy because they invaded. Okay, they did invade, but they were being provoked for 14 years. George Bush stood up in 2008 and said that he thought Ukraine and Georgia should be in NATO. And a few months later, Putin invaded Georgia and made sure Georgia would never join NATO. And then in 2014, the US and UK staged a coup, using the CIA and MI6 to overthrow a pro-Russian president of Ukraine. He was duly elected. They had an election. I'm not saying he was a great guy, but he was duly elected. He was pro-Russian, looking to enter into some trade linkages with Russia, and the US and UK intelligence services staged a coup, threw him out. He ran out for Russia. We put in a puppet government, and then Putin invaded and took Crimea. So first Bush makes a clumsy statement, Putin invades Georgia. Then they stage a coup and Putin invades Crimea. In other words, Putin is telling us, don't go there. Ukraine's not going to join NATO. You've crossed the red line. Then he invaded Georgia and Crimea to show he was serious, and the US still wasn't listening. Either that or we were listening and we wanted the war. And that's really my view. I think the warmongers, Victoria Nuland, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Susan Rice, and there are others, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Vindman, this whole warmonger crowd wanted this war, and they got it. So here's your war. Now, the war is tragic. It's brutal. That's what war is. And that's been going on for a while. But there is a financial, economic war wrapped around the military kinetic war, because the U.S., we've been supplying weapons to Ukraine and training, and Poland. A lot of these so-called Ukrainian troops are actually Polish troops wearing Ukrainian army uniforms because so many of the Ukrainian troops have been killed. Various weapon systems are being supplied. There's a drone war going on. Iran's giving drones to Russia. The U.S. has its own drones. They're supplying them to Ukraine, etc. So that's been pretty well vetted. But the economic financial war around it, the U.S. has put sanctions on Russia. The U.S., but also make it clear, the U.S. and the EU and the UK and other allies have joined these sanctions against Russia, and they are unprecedented. But these sanctions were announced, just to kind of give some examples. Sorry, Robert. So we froze the reserves of the Central Bank of Russia. Completely unprecedented. We froze the reserves of oligarchs. We kicked the Russian banking system out of the international SWIFT message traffic system, where it's kind of the nerve center, the beating heart, if you will, of the global financial system, based in Belgium, and Russia has been kicked out of that, and a lot else besides. limits on Russian oil exports, price caps on Russian oil, so forth. And Russia's retaliated. They banned certain exports of strategic metals, fertilizer, grain, and other essential goods to the rest of the world, or at least to countries that are participating in U.S. sanctions. The point is, it has been highly, highly disruptive to the to the supply chain and the food chain. It's contributed to inflation, and it's getting worse. So that much we know. We already know that, and it's a very big deal.
So this war in Russia and Ukraine is really a supply chain issue. That's how it affects you and me and all this. But isn't Ukraine also an exporter of food throughout the world?
Well, if you combine Russia and Ukraine, they provide 25% of global exports of wheat, 35% global exports of barley. Russia provides a large percentage of global fertilizer exports. So the answer is yes, absolutely. And if you look at it from the importing point of view, you say, okay, so Russia and Ukraine are 25% of the world's exports of wheat. It doesn't mean they grow that much wheat. It just means they export that much wheat. The U.S. grows more wheat, but we use it ourselves. We feed cows and pigs and make ethanol and do all kinds of other things with it. But Russia and Ukraine export a lot of it. But from the point of view of countries, you say, well, who gets their food from Ukraine and Russia? There you find countries get 75 to 90% of their food from those two places. And that includes countries like with large populations, Egypt, Sudan, countries in the Middle East, Kenya, and others, and many others. It's a long list.
That you mentioned, because of this war in the Ukraine, which was, we pissed off Russia, saying, they wanted Ukraine to join NATO and all this stuff. But now the supply chain, which is your book, sold out, is the food now goes into those countries like Sudan and all that. Does that mean that their prices will go up for food, but the possibility of starvation goes up too?
Yeah, I was going to say, it's not just about price. There's money around. You can get subsidies, but starvation is a bigger problem. And they've been scrambling since the war started last February, to the extent they've been getting anything. And believe it or not, some of the exports are going to Europe, which has other resources. And so starvation is a real, you may end up with more people dying of starvation than dying in the war. But this is playing out in real time. I was not saying everything's happened right now. It's happening, and it's going to get worse as the winter progresses. So they make airplanes. Well, they make them from aluminum and titanium. Where's that come from? Well, about 40% of it comes from Russia. What about farmers in Argentina, farmers in Brazil, farmers in parts of the United States for that matter? How do you grow crops? Well, you need nitrogen fertilizer. Where does nitrogen fertilizer come from? A lot of it comes from Russia. None of it's going to work, and it's going to be worse than that because it's going to boomerang and hurt us. And that's what I told them. And that's exactly what's happened. The Russian ruble, remember Joe Biden said, we're going to crush the Russian ruble. The ruble today is stronger in foreign exchange markets than it was before the war, et cetera. So Russia's oil revenues are up. The quantity might be down, but the price was up from where it was, and so they're making more money. The foreign exchange reserves are fine. By the way, 20% in gold. So you can't freeze the gold. You can freeze dollars, you can freeze treasury securities, but not the gold. So what could get worse than what we just described? And all this is continuing and getting worse, and that's a big factor for 2020.